President Trump thought he'd won. He demanded Canada cancel its digital tax, threatened brutal tariffs, and within days, Canada appeared to cave. Headlines screamed capitulation. Critics mocked Prime Minister Carney as weak. But what no one realized was that Trump had just walked into a trap, one so subtle, so brilliantly executed. It flipped the entire trade war on its head. Because that surrender, it was bait. And Carney was playing a long game that would secure Canada's biggest trade victory in decades. This wasn't just a clever move, it was a masterclass in using power against itself. Here's what really happened. It started with a threat, loud, unmistakable, and pure Trump. On June 25, 2025, President Donald Trump gave Canada a brutal ultimatum: eliminate the digital services tax or face immediate retaliation. Not just tariffs, devastating ones. And not just economic pressure, complete termination of all ongoing trade negotiations. The message was delivered with Trump's signature flair: bold, aggressive, and designed to humiliate. The world watched as Canada seemed to fold within days.
When it comes to Canada, this is really just the latest blow in what's already been a pretty fraught relationship between the U.S. and Canada, particularly when it comes to trade. And the White House's focus on digital services taxes isn't new. But what is new is that Canada is set to collect its first revenue from these taxes starting on Monday, and it will be retroactive for sales going back to 2022. And it appears that the administration has really taken issue with that point, that they would start collecting these revenues while trade negotiations were ongoing. And when we look at DSTs, as they're called, in the aggregate, they are expected to cost U.S. tech companies in the billions of dollars, something that the administration has really honed in on. Now, President Trump says that they will set an effective tariff rate sometime within the next 7 days. So we're waiting to see what that would look like, because as it stands currently, Canada is subject to a 25% levy on all non-USMCA compliant goods, but they're also paying those sector-specific tariffs, such as up to 50% when it comes to steel and aluminum. Going forward here, we did hear from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, earlier in an interview, who did threaten that the U.S. is likely going to launch what's known as a Section 301 investigation into unfair trade practices. So that would be what they are alleging is Canada's DST. And Joe and Kaylee, that would likely mean more tariffs on Canada to come.
Prime Minister Carney announced the repeal of the tax. The tax, which was set to collect retroactive payments from tech giants like Amazon, Meta, and Google, would have poured over $7 billion into Canadian coffers over 5 years. But it also painted a giant target on Canada's back. Trump responded exactly as expected, furiously.
Breaking news now. President Trump says he is terminating all trade discussions now with Canada. He just posted this on Truth Social, that Canada, which he calls a very difficult country to trade with, are putting a digital service tax on American tech companies, which Trump calls an attack on our country. So as a result, Trump says he's levying a new tariff on Canada and says he'll announce more details within the next week.
He called the tax an attack on America, pulled the plug on trade talks, and promised tariffs within a week. Critics at home pounced. Headlines blasted the move as weakness. Political opponents accused Carney of buckling under pressure and betraying Canadian sovereignty. Even U.S. officials went on air to claim victory. On the surface, they were right. Canada had backed down. But what almost no one realized was that this entire sequence had been triggered on purpose.
Canada says it's now dropping its digital services tax on American tech companies days after President Trump says he's halting all trade talks with Canada. First, what's the president's reaction to this? Can you tell us more about his call with Prime Minister Carney over the weekend? How did he get Carney to drop it? And also, what's the impact on American tech companies given this latest progress, as the president says he has been fighting for American tech companies?
It's very simple. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved to President Trump in the United States of America. And President Trump knows how to negotiate, and he knows that he is governing the best country and the best economy in this world, on this planet. And every country on the planet needs to have good trade relationships with the United States. And it was a mistake for Canada to vow to implement that tax that would have hurt our tech companies here in the United States. The president made his position quite clear to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister called the president last night to let the president know that he would be dropping that tax, which is a big victory for our tech companies and our American workers.
Carney had lit the fuse, and the explosive American response wasn't a defeat, it was the signal he was waiting for. While Trump saw victory, Carney saw opportunity. And behind the scenes, he was already setting the stage for far more ambitious play.
Billions of dollars in digital service taxes avoided. Canada decided to scrap its controversial tax on American tech companies just hours before the first payments were due. Ottawa said instead it will focus on advancing broader trade negotiations with the United States. The reversal comes after U.S. President Trump said over the weekend that he will be terminating all discussions on trade with Canada in response to Ottawa's decision to impose the tax, calling it a direct and blatant attack on the U.S. The first payments were initially set to be collected on Monday. The 3% levy would have been slapped on both domestic and foreign tech companies, including Meta, Amazon, and Google, on the money they make from Canadian users and customers. Since it was retroactive to 2022, U.S. companies could have been looking at a $2 billion tax bill. Canada's Minister of Finance and National Revenue said, quote, rescinding the digital services tax will allow the negotiations of a new economic and security relationship with the United States to make vital progress and reinforce our work to create jobs and build prosperity for all Canadians. That'll do it for your daily briefing from the New York Stock Exchange. I'm Caroline Woods with The Street.
To understand what really happened, you need to understand the man behind the move, Mark Carney. Unlike most politicians, Carney isn't a career lawmaker or party loyalist. He's a strategist, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Carney built his reputation not through speeches, but through precision. He's dealt with financial collapses, currency crises, and global institutions. He knows pressure. And more importantly, he knows how to use it.
Any reaction to the news you put on?
No, look, we'll continue to conduct these complex negotiations in the best interests of Canadians. It's negotiation.
When Carney stepped into the role of Prime Minister, many saw him as a technocrat, brilliant, but perhaps too measured for the rough arena of politics. But that's exactly what made him dangerous in this scenario. He didn't just see Trump's threats as bluster, he saw them as predictable reactions. Carney had studied Trump's patterns, not just as a president, but as a negotiator. He understood that Trump's strength wasn't in careful diplomacy, it was in emotional leverage, ego, dominance, control. And if those levers could be manipulated, then Trump himself could be maneuvered. So when Canada rolled out the digital services tax, fully aware it would provoke Trump, they weren't making a mistake. They were setting a trap Carney needed to draw out Trump's full response, to test how far he would go and how fast. He needed Trump to show his hand. And when the president delivered a full-scale economic threat in record time, Carney knew exactly what he was dealing with. Now, the real strategy could begin. The digital services tax wasn't a miscalculation, it was bait. For years, Canada had debated the idea of taxing massive US-based tech companies for the revenue they earned from Canadian users. It was controversial, unpopular with Washington, and guaranteed to spark backlash. So why implement it now when tensions with the U.S. were already high? Because Mark Carney didn't want the tax to pass, he wanted it to provoke. The design of the tax made it impossible to ignore. A 3% levy targeting companies like Apple, Amazon, Meta, Airbnb, and Uber. Even worse, from the American perspective, it was retroactive to 2022, meaning U.S. firms suddenly owed billions. It wasn't just a policy, it was a provocation. And Trump responded exactly as expected. He pulled out of trade talks, threatened tariffs, called the tax an economic attack. To the media, Canada looked like it had just shot itself in the foot. But in Carney's playbook, this was the moment he'd been planning for. Because now, Trump had revealed his weak point: control, the rage, the speed of retaliation. The dramatic social media posts, it all pointed to a man deeply uncomfortable with being challenged. Carney had achieved what most world leaders failed to do. He triggered Trump's ego. And that ego, once activated, could be steered. The tax had served its purpose. It exposed the playbook. Now, Carney knew how to push the president's buttons and how to turn that volatility into leverage. The real game was just getting started. The moment Canada repealed the digital services tax, headlines declared Trump the winner. News anchors framed it as a surrender. U.S. officials gloated, claiming they'd forced Canada to back down. But behind closed doors, something entirely different was unfolding. Carney wasn't retreating, he was repositioning. The tax wasn't Canada's goal. It was the opening sacrifice in a much larger game. By pulling the tax just before it was set to take effect, Carney did two things at once. He gave Trump a visible win, and he reset the tone of negotiations. Trump got what he wanted, a victory he could brag about. But what Carney got in return was far more valuable. A second chance at the negotiating table. Now armed with insight into Trump's psyche, Trump had shown his cards, his knee-jerk reaction to perceived slights, his obsession with dominance, his need to claim victory, even when the substance was hollow. Carney now understood that if Trump believed he was winning, he would negotiate, not as a bully but as a builder. So instead of fighting back publicly, Carney laid low. Quietly, Canada announced the resumption of trade talks with a hard deadline, July 21st. The tax was gone, but something far more important had been gained: control over the narrative. Critics at home didn't see it yet. Opposition leaders still. They accused Carney of caving. But in reality, he had just traded a tax for a roadmap, and what he was planning next would flip the entire power dynamic on its head. Carney's next move wasn't economic, it was psychological. He had already figured out the key to Trump's behavior. It wasn't just about winning, it was about feeling like he had won. Trump didn't need facts or balanced outcomes, he needed optics, dominance, and praise, and Carney was ready to give him all of that. Strategically, by framing the digital tax repeal as a concession, Carney fed Trump's ego. U.S. media picked it up, officials echoed the message, and Trump felt like the alpha. But that victory came with a hidden cost. Carney now controlled the tempo of the talks. The next round of negotiations wasn't framed as damage control. It was Carney inviting Trump back to the table with the illusion of leverage still in his hands. But in reality, Trump had already made a critical mistake. His explosive reaction had made it clear that U.S. tech companies were his pressure point. His threats revealed the depth of his need for control over trade narratives, and Carney took notes. So when the leaders met again, the tone had shifted. Carney flattered Trump publicly, spoke of shared prosperity, and emphasized respect between partners. Trump responded warmly, surprisingly so. The man who once called Canada a very difficult country now praised its leadership. What Trump didn't realize was that this newfound friendship was precisely engineered. Carney had identified the pressure points. Now, he was gently pressing them, not to provoke Trump, but to guide him exactly where Canada needed him to go. While the public fixated on Canada's retreat, Carney was quietly racking up wins. Behind closed doors, the digital tax was gone. But in its place came a series of trade-offs that would reshape Canada's economic future. And barely anyone noticed. Trump, basking in his apparent victory, was far more open to negotiation than ever before. And Carney seized that moment. In the weeks that followed, Canada secured unprecedented access to U.S. energy markets. Long-term deals guaranteed stable exports of oil, gas, and renewables, locking in billions in future revenue. In defense, Canada didn't just agree to buy American weapons, they negotiated technology-sharing agreements that would allow for domestic production, creating jobs and boosting sovereignty. Even in areas like border security and infrastructure, Carney managed to embed Canada into joint initiatives, framing them as shared North American priorities. For Trump, it was an easy sell. He was now the architect of a grand new partnership. He could brag about rebuilding trade with Canada on his terms, while Carney quietly rewrote the fine print. Perhaps the most brilliant move. Carney avoided triggering Trump's defensive instincts. By never asking for anything directly, every gain was framed as a mutual benefit, every concession as respect. Trump believed he was leading the negotiation. In truth, he was being led. These weren't surface-level wins, they were structural. They rewired the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. in a way that would protect Canadian interests for years. And the best part, Trump never saw it coming. Back in Canada, the backlash was immediate. Opposition leaders called the digital tax reversal a betrayal. Headlines accused Carney of folding under U.S. pressure. Business groups questioned whether Canada had given away too much for too little. Too many. It looked like the Prime Minister had blinked first in a high-stakes standoff. But Carney didn't flinch. He knew the criticism was coming, and he welcomed it. Why? Because while critics focused on the tax, they completely missed what had been gained in return. Carney had exchanged a controversial revenue stream for something far more valuable: leverage, access, and structural influence over the future of North American trade. The tax might have been worth $7 billion over 5 years, but the energy, defense, and tech agreements quietly negotiated behind the scenes could be worth many times that over the next 2 decades. And the real vindication came when the tone in Washington began to shift. Trump, who once threatened to cut off Canada, now publicly praised Carney as a strong leader and a great partner. That wasn't just political theater, it was proof that the strategy had worked. Trump felt like he'd won, and so he kept cooperating. Even more telling, world leaders began to take notice. Officials in Europe and Asia started studying Canada's approach. How had a middle power managed to diffuse Trump's aggression and turn it into collaboration? Carney didn't just protect Canada, he created a diplomatic blueprint others were now eager to copy. The surrender was beginning to look a lot like genius. What happened next confirmed everything Carney had gambled on. Trump didn't just accept the new terms, he started promoting them as his own achievement. He boasted about the historic partnership with Canada, praised the revamped trade talks, and even floated ideas for joint infrastructure and tech projects. Carney had played it perfectly. By letting Trump feel like the architect of the deal, he ensured the president would sell it to his own base. And once Trump took ownership, backing out became impossible. He was now to invest it. The narrative flipped. What began as a diplomatic crisis was now framed as a breakthrough. Carney, the supposed loser of the digital tax standoff, was now shaping the future of continental trade without ever appearing combative. Trump believed he'd won. In reality, he was walking deeper into a framework designed by Canada, and with every new headline, Carney's strategy became more undeniable. Mark Carney didn't just outmaneuver a volatile U.S. president. He rewrote the rules of modern diplomacy. By sacrificing a single tax, he gained long-term trade advantages, energy deals, defense cooperation, and most importantly, influence. What looked like surrender was, in truth, a calculated pivot that transformed a threat into an opportunity. Trump walked away thinking he'd won, but it was Carney who controlled the board. This wasn't luck. It was strategy executed with precision, patience, and psychological insight. Canada's so-called defeat became its greatest diplomatic triumph in decades, and no one saw it coming until it was already done.